Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us for Business Process Management in Manufacturing. My name is Nicole Bamford, and I'm the moderator for today's event. On behalf of Leslie and the team, we thank you for joining us. This presentation, Developing Manufacturing Agility for That Competitive Edge, will be given by Gary Castle, Industry Lead Global Manufacturing and Automotive at Appian. And he'll be joined by Diana Davis, Editor at Industrial Transformation Network. And their discussion promises to be well worth the listen. Before we get started, here are some quick administrative points. During the webinar, if you have questions for Gary or Diana, please submit them in the Q&A box on your screen, and these will be answered during the question portion of the session. Likewise, for any technical issues, please write them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them right away. The widgets on your screen can be resized and dragged around for your viewing preferences, and we encourage you to visit the Resource Center on your screen for additional content and resources we and our sponsors have provided for you. So make sure you're sitting comfortably, and I'll now hand it over to Diana so we can begin.
Thanks, Nicole, and hello to everyone from wherever you're joining us today. GE CEO recently compared this year's supply chains to a game of whack-a-mole. Just when you think you've got them all under control, another one pops up. We've seen chip shortages, fuel shortages, and in the depth of the first wave of the pandemic, who can forget the trouble with our toilet paper supply? The issues underlying these supply chain challenges are complex. COVID-19, material supply challenges, labor shortages, all have wreaked havoc on the ability of manufacturers to get the job done and get their products to customers. That's why it's so important right now that manufacturers can respond quickly to rapidly evolving situations. And that's where Gary comes in today to share his thoughts on how you can do just that. Gary, thank you for joining us today here at BPM in Manufacturing.
No, glad to be here.
So what are the key trends that you're seeing in the manufacturing industry as organizations work to build agility and resilience into their supply chains?
Yeah, and maybe before, there are 6 things I'd like to talk about, but kind of setting the stage a little bit, I was in a discussion just recently with some folks from KPMG and taking a look at their CEO executive survey that they do, as well as, there's some sources from Gartner on just kind of what's happening and what the feel is from, let's say CEOs, chief supply chain officers, other leaders in the operations and supply chain world. So from a couple of surveys, I actually picked out a few statistics that I think will be interesting in front of the trends. And, some are actually, they're pretty capturing as you think about, wow, that seems just ominous, and how do you tackle that? But in one case, as we talk about sort of that digitization that's happening in the world today in supply chains and operations, 22% of this, it was around 500 that were surveyed, supply chain leaders, say that they will have a digital ecosystem by 2025. So very short time to get a lot of work done. 74% of business leaders actually say they've accelerated digitization of their operations and next generation operating models. 78% of organizations surveyed, and this kind of gets to the disruption side of it, have had at least one significant disruption since COVID. And of those 78%, 76% of them experienced large revenue loss from those disruptions. And then this one was the one that just really captured me as I was listening and reading on some of these statistics. 72% actually responded and said they still use spreadsheets for critical planning and business activities. And there was also one that I thought was kind of stunning. I thought it would have been much smaller than this, but 26% of organizations responded and said they do not analyze the source of a supply chain disruption. So they just deal with it, go on, probably experience it again. And the one thing that I would say COVID did tell us is those that really have upped the game of planning, risk mitigation, as well as supply chain planning, they were better prepared to mitigate, to some degree, the disruption that we saw during that time. Now, kind of getting to the trends, and I think some will tie pretty closely into these statistics. Prior to coming into 2021, a lot of companies that didn't have supply chain digitization as an initiative on their radar, they got that on their radar. They actually started investment work. So what we're seeing is a lot of that automation, digitization efforts in the supply chain environment. And you hear a lot about visibility. I want visibility of all the transactions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what companies are really after there is not just a view of those supply chain activities, a view of their demand, a view of their inventory, but they want to act on what the issues are. So kind of get me out of that, I always call it the swivel chair process, where I've got to go to multiple places to do something. I want that control tower that allows me to understand when I have an issue ahead of time, get in a proactive state, and be able to go mitigate it to what degree that I can prior to the actual disruption occurring. And number two is that trend that we continue to see, and these are going to go on. I mean, they're big in 2021. They will continue over the next couple of years. But companies are deepening their relationships or partnerships with their suppliers. In one bit of research I was doing, it even called it supplier peers. Bring them in as a peer. But it's really about making information flow between the supplier and, let's say, that organization at a different transparency level than what happens today. And real-time collaboration, real-time decision-making, not let's do a quarterly review of the business, but let's work together day to day. Number three is really companies sort of making those investments in elevating their planning capabilities. This happens in a couple of different areas when I talk about planning. One is in sort of that demand and supply planning. So kind of moving from that sales and operation planning to kind of raising the bar to an integrated business planning process. So having your suppliers engaged, your operations, knowing financial targets, and making sure all that ties together as one integrated business planning process. And number four is, and I mentioned this a bit in the statistics, is companies are looking at their operating models. And we hear the word a lot about composable business structures today. And that's really the view of the operating model in this particular perspective is, how do I look at, evaluate the operating model that I'm running? Maybe I have my supply chain operating model as an example, and ensure that it's composable so that I can act fast, make change quick, adapt quickly to those changing market trends, as well as any significant disruptions that we see coming. And then another, I have this sort of number five. These are not in priority order, by the way, but companies will continue to work to shorten their supply chains. So think of that as the terms we hear with nearshoring, onshoring. But what I'm seeing is that it's not necessarily I move from one supplier that maybe is an international supplier to something that's more on an onshore basis. It's a lot about multi-sourcing. Because if I go with a critical component with one supplier, I still have a risk there. So in the play of resiliency, or the strategy to build resilience, what I'm seeing is some nearshoring that's happening, but there's a percentage that says, hey, I still want my international supplier, and I want some percent of that supply that's coming locally. So on those critical components, this isn't across the board, but on those critical pieces of material or components that I buy, I need the multi-source to really build that resilience in. And then sort of the last piece, and it's really kind of overarching across all these trends, it's really the sustainability. Sustainability came to prominence in 2020, and it's continued to really grow in importance as we go forward. I was looking up some statistics on this, and recently there's an article out there on the EPA, so a North America site, that really stated that 90% of a company's greenhouse gas emissions come from their supply chains. And if you think about that, if you're familiar with sort of the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, that's all of those combined come from a company's supply chains. And McKinsey actually published an article recently, maybe mid-year, I think, and from their research of a number of companies, they found that 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions were related to scope 3 emissions. So sort of, you could almost say from their suppliers. So that includes the transportation element of it also. So those are sort of the 6 kind of key things I'm seeing. The one point I would make too, as you're building, as companies are building in sort of this agility and resilience, when you think about the sustainable part, and when I say it's overarching of those, of all the other trends, is that creating efficiencies in the supply chain will actually have positive results in those greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. It sounds like there's a number of things that manufacturers can do then to address these supply chain challenges. But one of the things that you've mentioned is this digitization effort.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest challenges that companies face with their digitization efforts?
Now, I think the largest is those siloed systems, siloed data, siloed business processes. That to me, in almost every discussion I have with, supply chain or manufacturing leaders, that's the challenge that they have, is pulling that together, looking to say, how do I actually bring all that information together so that I have that. Now I'll go back to the visibility piece. So I have that 360-degree view of the business, and I have the ability to get predictive alerts that I can actually respond to, and I don't have to go to multiple places to do that. That to me is sort of the largest challenge that I see. And a lot of the times companies take on these long duration projects, I call them waterfall projects, to try and address some of those capability gaps. And they normally fall short. And what happens with those, and you can look back in time also, is you find that there's a lot of manual processes that pop up to fill some of those capability gaps. And those are, of course, are not sustainable over the long term as people change roles, kind of move to different roles within the company. It's usually something that, somebody else has to pick up and learn, well, what was this process? And you're normally getting the negative impact from it while somebody's learning that this even existed, because a lot of the times what I found is they're hidden factors, and it becomes a real challenge in that automation effort. And having those siloed systems and that siloed data, a lot of the times when we talk automation, there's a thought of RPA, and I think you have to think broader than RPA. RPA is sort of doing those repetitive tasks, but having a strategy to automate and digitize, whether it's operations or whether it's parts of the supply chain or the end-to-end view of the supply chain, it has to be broader. It's having that digital overlay that brings it all together. So RPA is a component of that, but a 360-degree interface is a part of that. I'm able to actually access and integrate data from multiple systems to give my employees, and if I'm using portals for customers to do self-service, where they can get the information in one place really quickly and make decisions and adapt fast.
So supply chain visibility has and is still a hot topic with lots of different definitions. What are companies really looking for with this capability?
Yeah, and And Diana, I would say that, from discussions that I have, and even projects I did when I was in the industry to get that visibility, what companies or manufacturers are looking for is not just to know their inventory, but to have a sense of what demands coming into the business, what my production schedules are, what my supplier, what demand I put on my supplier, actually having that full 360 view across the enterprise so that I can actually map available inventory or allocated inventory to my production schedules, my customer demand. I can get a view of product that's in movement, from a supplier in. Having that logistics visibility gives me another capability to say, hey, I can be very predictive. If I've got a container stuck at a port, I will know that, and I can get an alert, from the intelligence of, let's say, a platform tool that's sitting across and providing this digital overlay, so that I can act on it versus I'm loading data into a data warehouse, or a data lake, which is great on the analytics side, but for that sort of day-to-day, I need to make decisions today to avoid or to better mitigate issues that are coming. I need that real-time connection to the information and the data and the alerts. To me, that's what we should all be looking for when we talk about visibility. It's just not something that's telling me or giving me a view, but something that has a predictive alert, or it has predictive alerts with it, and it has the ability to actually allow me to act on it. But I would even go one step further. Once you get there, and this is why I say you think bigger than RPA, is having the intelligence, AI, machine learning, that can make recommendations. It learns how we respond to the event, and business rules, and having learned that, it can actually make recommendations and provide the response to certain types of mitigations or certain types of risks that appear.
So we've heard and read a lot about organizations making changes to their supplier network to become more resilient. What types of network changes are you seeing companies make?
Well, I think on the supplier side, and I talked a little bit about this on the trend, is really that it is shortening the supply chain. So a lot of the heading towards that multi-sourcing, whether we call it nearshoring or onshoring. But I think it goes further than that also. As you look at even on the outbound side, so the fulfillment side of the equation, is looking at the distribution channel that I have today, and what changes need to be made to that. Because at the end of the day, I'm really looking to satisfy my customers' expectations and their requirements. So if I can manage the inbound side well, I still also have to manage the fulfillment side very well, and give those customers, which we know today with all the the e-commerce movement that's happening, with just all the changes happening in customer expectations, that there has to be that agility on that side of the equation also. So in that, I would also say, and kind of re-emphasize on the supplier side, is really extending the collaboration into the forecasting and planning processes, not just kind of doing them in the silo again and then putting demand on the supplier, but having them as part of that process, sharing where demand is going. If I see demand on a quick rise, whether it's a spike or it's just it's moving up, having that collaboration so that I've got my supply base connected to that also.
Absolutely. Well, with so much change then happening in today's supply chains, how can manufacturing leaders evaluate and minimize the risk of all these changes?
Yeah, and that's a great question.
It's the hot one, isn't it?
It is the hot one. And I I think, a simple statement is to say, hey, we really do need to raise the bar on risk assessment. But how do you do that? That's really the tough part. I mean, you can do qualification type risk. You can do risk on analysis on different frequencies. One of the most interesting things, I was actually in a discussion with some supply chain leaders recently, and we were talking about digital twins. And the ability to actually take a digital twin and identify, sort of where are my vulnerabilities in the supply chain? Where am I most vulnerable? And actually doing scenario planning based on those vulnerabilities. Now, those vulnerabilities can be, it can be I'm single sourced, so I want to make sure I understand and I can actually do continuity planning if I have a constraint with a supplier that I'm single sourced with. So how does that affect the upstream and downstream part of my supply chain? That having the ability to do that, and again, it really does take that sort of platform digital overlay to do that, because I do need real-time data to do that. I think of years ago, and probably not that many, but a few years back, doing network analysis and just the effort to do that, because you didn't have this evergreen kind of environment or this digital twin that was evergreen, allowing me to say, hey, if I change supply from here to here, if I add a second supplier, and for this source, what does that do to my transportation network? What does that do to my inventory levels? What does that do to my fulfillment levels? Having that digital twin capability connected to the real information and being able to do that scenario planning really ups the game on risk analysis. And I had a discussion with a couple of large consumer goods organizations. They're manufacturers of consumer goods, and they had actually gone to the level of, and this is where I was kind of digging into this with them, of actually plugging weather scenarios in, where they had plants that were in places where susceptible to hurricanes, as an example. And they had a continuity plan that said, if there is a severe weather alert in this particular area, here's how we move our product in order to mitigate the disruption that would occur with that plant. And they had a couple of cases where they had done that, and it really tremendous success in not creating a constraint in their supply chain because of that particular occurrence. So that digital twin really gives insights. And there's two ways to look at the digital twin process. I tend to look at it much more when I'm talking about supply chain in the view of the process. But there's also the digital twin side of things in manufacturing, to have a product type digital twin.
Do you think we're going to be moving from just-in-time supply chains more to a just-in-case kind of supply chain approach?
Yeah, I think that does get into the composable side of the business, that they have, looking at not just the operating model itself, but also looking at my entire network and say, how do I make that composable so that when I have the situations that create risk, whether I'm it's something that I can predict or something that happens pretty quickly, I've positioned the business in a way, and this is really what composability does, to adjust and respond in a very fast manner to that. So I think there is that just-in-time piece, but I think that's part of that risk evaluation that you have to run through also, that says, there's always a trade-off, right? In every decision you make, you're making a trade-off. What's the easiest when you put your business model together, or what's the most efficient way to then take that composable business model and adjust to that risk or adjust to that inventory level when we talk about just-in-time, or actually saying, well, in this case, I'm going to increase in this area because of this risk.
Absolutely. So my final question before we open it up for Q&A, over the last year, businesses have had to make many adjustments to respond to these supply chain disruptions, adapt to changing customer expectations, that's probably a longer term change, and ensure focus on sustainability. What will manufacturers need to focus on, in your opinion, in the next 3 to 5 years to ensure that they really remain competitive in the markets that they serve?
Yeah, and a lot that I think we've talked about a few of these things, but I really liked the categories that Gartner put in a recent article that they published, and it was really sort of the 4 different categories, or to say this is where the focus needs to be, and they were both business and technology categories. And one that was called amplified engagement was the term that Gartner used. And that really does get into a lot of what we've been talking about in building agility and resilience, which is sort of that collaboration and transparency piece with whether it's suppliers, carriers, customers, but actually having that supply network, that end-to-end view of things. The other kind of is a trend that we're seeing, and this has been happening to some degree, but I think it's happening at a much faster rate now than it has in the past. But product manufacturers, for example, are really wanting to be more than just a product manufacturer. So to provide services or connectability to their products once a customer has them, to actually optimize that customer's full experience with the product. Continuous revenue is kind of the category that Gartner uses. And you can think of that in some cases as equipment as a service. Instead of purchasing a big capital piece of equipment, it becomes more of a cycle of, the manufacturer continues to be connected to it, and it is it's a cost for use of the usage time versus big capital outlay to purchase a piece of equipment. I think one that we're seeing also is location independence. And that's kind of the operations anywhere. From a technology standpoint, we think about virtual reality, augmented reality, the ability to train employees in their remote work environments, but also the ability to actually do operational work in remote locations. And then one that I think is highly important, and this is sort of the fourth and the last, is, again, something we've been talking about through this discussion, is resilient delivery. And resilient delivery, it's a lot about what we've discussed, right? It's, supply chain visibility, ensuring, that ecosystem with partners. But on the order fulfillment side, so with customers, I kind of term this order from anywhere, ship from anywhere, is that simplify the view for your customers. In a lot of cases, what I see, and maybe this is one of those challenges that organizations have, is because of all the complexities in a multi-echelon type network, when I have to fulfill from multiple sites, there's a lot of manual effort that goes into that behind the scenes. And kind of putting that platform or that digital overlay to manage all that complexity allows, whether they're order management representatives or customer service reps, to actually have a 360-degree view, just as a customer can have that, and really focus on the customer side of things versus the internal side of things. Simplify that work for those folks.
Very good. Well, thank you, Gary. We are approaching time now. So I'd like to open it up for Q&A from the audience. I would invite anyone sitting there today. It's a great opportunity to get your questions answered. I think Gary has a lot of amazing experience, and he's in touch with a lot of, he has a more global view of the industry as well. So please get your questions answered. We do have one question here to start off, Gary. I think this is a great one to begin on. Which is for organizations just beginning their automation journey. Where do they start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, it is one where, what I would say I always recommend approach it in a very agile fashion. I think the days of the long duration, wait, 18 months or 24 months to actually have a result, those days are kind of quickly, if not already, behind us. So, my recommendations always start in an agile fashion. Find that, when you lay sort of the work out in automation, find those things that initially will deliver value quickly, but they're things you have control of. Don't create a highly complex project on the first, I'll call it the first sprint. And lay the work out in those sprints. So, the one thing that I continually see is, as you deliver quickly and actually start providing value, the momentum starts. And then others want to be part of it. And they start seeing the opportunities of automation more. And then, as you kind of define it, I would say, know where you want to go, right? I mean, any strategic decision, I need that vision of where I'm going so that the decisions I make along the way, because it is a journey, but the decisions that I make along the way are always taking into account where I want to end up. And there's lots of tools out there, but the platform, and I think this is where like an Appian actually caught my attention, it's a full automation platform that provides me the ability to do real time and quick activities in development. I can think of one use case with a large chip manufacturer where we were able to provide inventory visibility across their enterprise in 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, it was not a 6-month or an 18-month type project. So I think those are the things that, have that vision, sort of break things up in agile type sprints, deliver value quickly, the momentum really starts to gain. And, I think what you find when you are going down that path is it really pulls the organization in because they want to be part of that because they can see the value that's being delivered.
Absolutely. We've got another question come in here, I think sort of related. Very often we struggle with automation solutions because of the high cost associated with equipment and infrastructure. How do we manage this to enable a financially viable transformation? Yeah,
I mean, it's a good question. And a lot of that, when you think about sort of the cloud approach, that does try to address that big investment in infrastructure piece. So cloud has kind of come into play pretty heavily. You'll see a lot of articles out there about how it does help with that particular, let's say the high cost. Again, you can almost put it in the equipment as a service category, right? Where it's not a this big capital outlay that I have to do right up front of a project. And then, the traditional way of actually getting apps in place also, it is the long duration coding and so forth. A platform play like what an Appian brings to the table is more, you're basically drawing the workflow, and that's creating an enterprise-ready type application. So the low-code platform really, and I think Forrester actually did a study and said it's 17 times faster to deliver capabilities with, like an app with Appian's low-code platform than to do the traditional coding process. And that ties into the data integration side of it also. So, data anywhere type technology really does speed that delivery up. And I think that does help not only from a cost standpoint, but from getting the momentum with delivering quickly.
Thank you very much, Gary. Well, I think we're approaching our time now, but thank you for answering all my questions. And we're looking forward to the rest of the sessions here at BPM in Manufacturing.
That's great to be here. Thanks, Diana. Really appreciate it.
And back to you, Nicole.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary and Diana, for your very interesting discussion today. For those in the audience, if you want to listen again, this webinar will be available on demand shortly. And finally, thank you to you wherever you are for taking the time to listen in. We look forward to having you on the next session, which will wrap up the day's event, starting in just a few moments. And again, thank you so much, Diana and Gary, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.